He was born into the greatest fortune America had ever produced, raised in a 70-room palazzo overlooking the Atlantic, educated at the finest schools his era offered, and handed tens of millions of dollars at the precise moment in his life when he was least equipped to do anything useful with them. Reginald Claypoole Vanderbilt received everything the dynasty his great-grandfather had built could give a man. The name, the houses, the social position, the money. He received all of it, and he spent the next 24 years converting it, methodically and without apparent regret, into nothing. By the time he died at 45 in a Rhode Island farmhouse on a September morning in 1925, the liquid assets remaining in his estate outside a protected trust fund came to approximately $130,000. The inheritance had been somewhere between $15 and $25 million, depending on which bequest you counted and which year you measured from. And yet the story of Reginald Vanderbilt is not simply the story of a man who wasted what he was given. It is more complicated and more instructive than that. Because in the same years that he was burning through one of the largest inherited fortunes in American history, he was also doing one genuinely constructive thing. On January 20th, 1917, Reginald Vanderbilt called together representatives of 50 horse shows from across the United States in a meeting room in Manhattan and organized them into the body that became the governing institution for American equestrian competition. That organization still exists today. It has overseen every American Olympic equestrian team for more than a century. The riding ring he built at his Rhode Island farm, finished in 1902, remained in active use until 2023, nearly a century after the man who commissioned it died in the house beside it. He reportedly said at some point in the years before the end that every Vanderbilt son had increased his fortune. He was the one who had not. He said it as a plain statement of fact, without apparent drama. He could see it clearly. He simply could not stop. What drove him to that particular end? What the family he was born into produced in a youngest son who was never meant to carry the weight of the dynasty, and what the life he consumed left standing behind him, is the story of one of the strangest figures the Gilded Age ever put into the world. This is Reginald Claypoole Vanderbilt, the heir nobody talks about, the one who lost everything first. Before we go any further into Reggie's story, we would love to know where in the world you are watching from today. Drop your city or country in the comments below. It genuinely makes a difference to know who is out there with us. And if you are new here, please consider subscribing so you never miss another story like this one. Now, to understand what Reginald lost, we first have to understand the world he was born into. The house at the corner of 5th Avenue and 57th Street in Manhattan was not a house by any normal standard. It covered an entire city block. It cost more than $1 million to build in the early 1880s, at a time when a skilled laborer in New York might earn $500 in a full year of work. Its interiors were designed by John Lafarge and Augustus St. Gaudens, craftsmen whose work also appeared in the finest civic buildings and churches in the country. George B. Post designed the structure itself, a red brick and limestone edifice of such overwhelming scale that it became known simply as the Vanderbilt Mansion, as though no further specification were needed to identify it among all the buildings in the most densely inhabited city in America. It was, across the 1880s and 1890s, the most famous private residence in the United States, the physical embodiment of what the Vanderbilt name had come to mean. Cornelius Vanderbilt II, who commissioned it and raised his family inside it, was the grandson of the original Commodore. He had inherited approximately $70 million from his own father, William Henry, in 1885, and had taken his place as chairman and president of the New York Central Railroad, the institutional core of the family enterprise. He was a trustee of Columbia University, a director of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, a supporter of the YMCA, the Red Cross, the Salvation Army, Trinity Church, and St. Bartholomew's Church, where he and his wife, Alice Claypoole Gwynn, had first met while both volunteering as Sunday school teachers. His philanthropy was so extensive that despite starting with $70 million, he would die without having increased the sum, having given so much away that the fortune remained essentially static across his 14 years at its head. He was, in the estimate of virtually everyone who observed him across those years, a man of total and consuming seriousness. A lifelong acquaintance remarked in later years that he never once recalled seeing Cornelius Vanderbilt the second smile. Not once, across decades of knowing the man. This was the household Reginald grew up in. This was the emotional temperature he absorbed as normal. The family was not confined to Manhattan. Each summer brought the migration to Newport, Rhode Island, where the Vanderbilts had been building their particular version of the social world for decades. By the time Reginald was a teenager, his father had commissioned and completed the Breakers, the summer residence that became the most celebrated private house in America. Architect Richard Morris Hunt designed it in the Italian Renaissance Revival style, drawing on the 16th century palaces of Genoa and Turin for his inspiration. The structure covered approximately 62,000 square feet across 5 floors, with 70 rooms total, including 48 bedrooms and 33 rooms designated for the household staff and their families alone. The grounds stretched across 13 acres of coastal land, with terraced lawns descending from the mansion toward the cliffs above the Atlantic Ocean. The interior featured imported marble, crystal chandeliers, frescoed ceilings, and a great hall whose dimensions were such that it accommodated more than 300 guests for the debut party of Reginald's sister Gertrude on August 14, 1895. Guests who danced until dawn while the Atlantic moved in the darkness below the cliff. The Breakers cost approximately $7 million to build across 2 years of construction. It was completed in 1895, 1 year before everything in the family began to break apart. Reginald was the 6th of 7 children. His eldest brother, William Henry II, died of typhoid fever while attending Yale in 1892, before Reginald was old enough to really know him, and the loss reorganized the family's expectations without anyone fully articulating what had changed. The next eldest surviving son, Cornelius III, called Neely in the family, was positioned by every institutional expectation of the dynasty as the heir who would carry the railroad and the name forward. He was serious and intellectually capable, already moving through Yale with the kind of deliberateness that his father recognized and valued. His sister Gertrude, born in 1875, was demonstrating, even in her youth, an artistic intelligence that set her apart from the social performance her class expected of her. His brother Alfred, born in 1877, was steady and trusted, the one their father seemed to regard as the most reliable instrument for carrying the family enterprises into the next generation. His youngest sister Gladys would eventually marry into European nobility, becoming the wife of a Hungarian count, and Reginald was the youngest surviving son. What it means to be the youngest son in a dynasty at its absolute peak is a specific and underexamined kind of inheritance. It is not the freedom of the daughters, who in that era and that class were simply expected to marry into other families and conduct their lives within a different set of constraints. It is not the weight of the heir, who is defined by his purpose before he is old enough to have chosen it, whose every year at school is understood as preparation for a role already written. It is something in between and below both of those positions. The name without the designated role, the wealth without the mission assigned to it, the education at St. Paul's School in Concord, New Hampshire, and then Yale, because Vanderbilt's sons attended those institutions, but without the governing expectation that turned his brother's days into directed labor toward a clear end. Cornelius II had organized his entire existence around duty, stewardship, and the responsible continuation of what the Commodore had built. What the youngest son absorbed from watching that life was not the discipline. It was the scale. The scale was simply everywhere, constant and unearned, present in the height of the ceilings and the number of servants and the assumption in every room of every house that this was simply how things were. What was entirely invisible to a child growing up in that household was the labor that had produced it 3 generations back, and that had been renewed less intensely in each generation since. By Reginald's generation, the labor was simply gone from view. Reginald was 12 years old when his eldest surviving brother was carried home from New Haven in a coffin, and the family's attention reorganized itself around Nellie and Alfred without anyone pausing to consider what the youngest son was making of all this. He was watching it from the youngest son's position, present and peripheral simultaneously, included in the household, but not in the calculations. The machinery of the dynasty turned around him without quite including him in its purposes. He was a Vanderbilt son with every material advantage that designation carried, and with no particular assignment attached to any of it. When he was old enough for that vacancy to matter, the family was about to produce a crisis that would define everything that came after. Reginald was 16 years old in the summer of 1896 when his brother Neely did something the family would never fully recover from. Grace Graham Wilson was the youngest daughter of Richard Thornton Wilson, a New York banker whose money was substantial, but whose social origins were, in the estimation of the established Vanderbilt world, fatally insufficient. Her father had been a Georgia farm boy who made his fortune himself. Starting with cotton speculation during the Civil War years, while, as one contemporary account noted with undisguised contempt, more gentlemanly Southerners were away fighting. He had risen to genuine wealth through his own effort, and the Vanderbilts regarded that particular history with the specific distaste of people who had forgotten, within 2 generations, that their own patriarch had also started from nothing on Staten Island. Grace was auburn-haired, socially capable, and possessed of an ambition that would eventually transform her into the most celebrated hostess in the United States. None of this interested Cornelius II, who had decided she was unsuitable for his heir and considered the matter settled. Neely had met Grace during the social season of 1895 and pursued her with a persistence that made clear he understood exactly what he was risking. The engagement was announced on June 10, 1896, which was also the date the wedding had originally been scheduled to take place. On that same day, before the ceremony had even occurred, Cornelius II had already revised his will, rewriting the distribution of the family estate with the deliberateness of a man who had thought through every implication and meant every word of what he was doing. The wedding took place on August 3, 1896, at the Wilson family residence in a private ceremony that the Vanderbilt parents did not attend and had done everything within their considerable authority to prevent. The confrontation between father and son in the weeks surrounding the wedding escalated to a physical altercation. Neely was expelled from the Fifth Avenue mansion. His mother Alice did not speak to him again for 27 years. Then Cornelius II suffered a severe paralytic stroke that left him unable to walk, confined to a wheelchair for the remaining 3 years of his life. He continued to oversee the family enterprises as best he could from his reduced position, appearing at Newport when it was possible, managing the railroad from his chair. But the full force that had defined him was gone. He died on the morning of September 12, 1899, waking his wife Alice and informing her that he thought he was dying before doing exactly that. He was 55 years old. The will was read. The estate was appraised at nearly $73 million. Alfred, the second surviving son, received $36.5 million, along with the gold congressional medallion that had symbolized the headship of the Vanderbilt family since the Commodore's era, the heirloom that had come to signify who led the dynasty. The other siblings, including Reginald, received approximately $7 million each. Neely received $500,000 from an estate of nearly $73 million. A newspaper in Scotland, syndicating an obituary, noted that the difference between the shares left to Alfred and Cornelius III was the precise measure of the father's disapproval of his son's marriage to Miss Grace Wilson. It was the most efficient summary anyone produced of what the will was actually saying. Alfred gave Neely $6 million of his own inheritance without ceremony or announcement, because it was the right thing to do, and because Alfred was, by all accounts, a man of genuine decency in a family that occasionally produced such people. It was one of the few clearly generous acts in this portion of the story. Reginald was 19 years old when his father died, freshly enriched and enrolled at Yale. It would not go the way his father had intended or the way his brothers had managed it, and the shape of what was coming was visible to anyone positioned to look. At Yale, Reginald demonstrated with some speed that he had not inherited his father's appetite for work, his brother Neely's appetite for degrees, or his brother Alfred's steady sense of purpose. The contrast with Neely was particularly instructive. Neely had returned to Yale in the years of his exile, when the family had expelled him and stripped him of his inheritance, and had treated academic work as a form of self-discipline and proof of character. He earned a Bachelor of Arts in 1895, a Bachelor of Philosophy in 1898, and a Master of Engineering in Mechanical Engineering in 1899. 3 Yale degrees accumulated during the period when his own family had formally rejected him. The discipline that punishment forced on Neely was extraordinary. Reginald, welcomed and fully funded, attended for approximately 2 years and left without completing his first degree. At Yale, the social world had absorbed him. The clubs, the card games, the horse racing conversations, the particular atmosphere of young men with large allowances and no immediate obligations. Gambling became, during those Yale years, something more than a passing amusement. It became a persistent pursuit with its own rhythms and requirements, a way of organizing time and sensation that asked nothing of the participant beyond willingness to sit down and play. He also, in those Yale years, developed his relationship with horses from the casual interest of a wealthy boy into something more genuine and more serious. As a young man, he was a capable polo player, noted by people who observed him as having real talent for the sport, rather than the performed enthusiasm of someone using expensive equipment to signal membership in a class. The horses would eventually become the one domain of his adult life where the serious people around him took him seriously. By approximately 1901, when Reginald turned 21 and came formally into the inheritance his father had established for him, the shape of the next 2 decades was completely legible to anyone who had watched the Yale years unfold. The inheritance was approximately $15.5 million. On the night he received it, according to accounts repeated across virtually every source that has touched his life in the century since, he sat down at a gambling table and lost $70,000 before the evening was over. $70,000 in 1901 was not an amusing anecdote about youthful excess. It was a sum that required a skilled New York worker approximately 140 years to earn at the prevailing wages of that era. Reginald lost it in a single sitting, on the same night he received what would have been a lifetime of security for almost any other person alive. He did not appear to experience this as a catastrophe, or as a warning about the direction his life was taking, or as a reason to make any adjustment to his intentions. He experienced it, by all available evidence, as an evening. The money had arrived and had immediately begun flowing outward, as though it had a destination that was not his hands. What drove the gambling was not at its core a financial need. He had more money than he could spend at any reasonable pace across a long life. What drove it was something that looks recognizable from a distance in the children of dynasties who received their wealth without having pursued it. The need to feel the stakes of something real, to place something at genuine risk, to sit in a position where the outcome is not already determined by who you are and what your name commands. When everything you possess arrived without any effort on your part, when the rooms you grew up in were simply there and the social position was simply granted and the money simply accumulated in accounts you had never had to think about filling, nothing you possess feels entirely real. The gambling gave the money a velocity it did not otherwise have. For the duration of a hand, the numbers meant something. Then the hand ended and the meaning evaporated, and it had to be purchased again the following evening. The horses asked something different from him. In the equestrian world, Reginald encountered standards that existed independently of his name. A thoroughbred's performance did not adjust itself to accommodate the sensitivities of its owner. The other serious people in the sport were serious people who had earned their positions through knowledge and skill, and would not simply defer to a Vanderbilt who appeared at ringside with money to spend. You could not inherit your way to a well-trained horse or gamble your way to breeding expertise. You actually had to know what you were doing, and in this one domain, Reginald genuinely did. His talent for horses was real, his knowledge was substantive, and the people who shared his world in the sport recognized both. In 1902, Reginald purchased Sandy Point Farm in Portsmouth, Rhode Island, a few miles from the cluster of Vanderbilt estates that had gathered in the area around Newport over the previous generation. His brother Alfred had already developed Oakland Farm nearby for equestrian purposes. Reginald bought Sandy Point and began building on a scale that reflected simultaneously his genuine passion for the sport and his complete inability to apply financial restraint when something interested him sufficiently. He commissioned architect A.S. Walker, and what emerged across the subsequent years was a complex that became, during the first 2 decades of the 20th century, one of the most celebrated equestrian facilities in the United States. The stables housed 24 horses in purpose-built stalls. The indoor riding arena covered 15,000 square feet, its ceiling rising to a 60-foot peak capped by cupolas, visible from the road approaching the farm. The main structural beams were cypress measuring 2 inches by 24 inches, a scale of construction typically associated with civic or industrial buildings rather than private sport facilities. A viewing balcony for invited guests was reached by crossing a sunken formal garden and a pergola porch, opening into a reception room with a rustic stone fireplace, and an adjoining trophy room where the evidence of what the farm produced was displayed for the people who understood what they were looking at. The grounds extended from East Main Road to the Sakonnet River, a substantial sweep of Rhode Island coastal land that became, during the Newport summer social season, a destination not only for the horse people who came to watch serious equestrian work, but for the full upper stratum of society that gathered in that part of the world each summer. Sandy Point was the one place in Reginald's adult life where the money he spent and the purpose he attached to it were genuinely aligned. What he was building at Sandy Point was not merely a personal pleasure facility on a grand scale. It was the physical headquarters of the most genuinely productive institutional project of his adult life. Through years of serious involvement in the sport, Reginald had become a figure of real authority in the American equestrian world. He was president of the National Horse Show Association. He was president of the American Hackney Horse Society. He participated actively in the governance of horse breeding and equestrian competition at every level, from local shows through national events, with a disciplined engagement that he brought to no other aspect of his life. On January 20th, 1917, Reginald convened a meeting in Manhattan and brought together representatives of 50 horse shows from across the United States. The purpose was explicit: to create a unified national body that would establish common standards, ensure clean and fair competition across the sport at every level, and give the American equestrian world the institutional coherence it had lacked. The organization that emerged from that January meeting was formally constituted at its first annual meeting on January 29, 1918, with 26 established shows enrolled as charter members. Reginald served as founding president. By January of 1924, 67 shows had joined from across the country, the organization having expanded its reach well beyond the eastern seaboard where it had originated. By the time Reginald died in 1925, the membership stood at nearly 70 shows. The body he created that winter would eventually become US Equestrian, the governing organization for American equestrian competition, including the Olympic Games, which continues its work to the present day. His name is not prominently attached to it in any way that the average person who encounters the organization would notice. During the First World War, Reginald issued a public appeal for expanded horse breeding programs across the United States and Canada to support the military's need for horses in the European theater. It was taken seriously. Men of wealth across the country responded with commitments that materially affected the national breeding stock during the war years. This was a man who understood how to organize people around a shared purpose, how to convene a room and produce an institution when the purpose was something he cared about deeply enough to pursue with actual sustained discipline. Time magazine noted in his obituary, published in September of 1925, that the world Reginald had moved through with such debonair magnificence was already being demolished while he was still alive inside it. Delmonico's, where he had hosted numerous dinners across the decades of his active social life, had recently closed its doors for the last time. Madison Square Garden, at whose ringside he had been a constant presence during the National Horse Show, described by the magazine with characteristic precision as brooding over the proceedings, had been torn down. The gilded world that had formed the complete context of his adult existence was being erased building by building, season by season. He had invested his fortune entirely in inhabiting that world, and in nothing that might outlast it. When the world itself began to go, there was no foundation underneath it. In the spring of 1903, the year after he had begun developing Sandy Point Farm, Reginald married for the first time. His bride was Kathleen Gebhard Nielsen, the daughter of Isabel Gebhard Nielsen, connected through family to the Gebhard family, whose fortunes intersected with the prominent circles of New York real estate and banking. The wedding took place on April 29th at Parker Cottage in Newport, Rhode Island, with the full social weight of a Vanderbilt union conducted during the height of the Newport season. Reginald was 23, Kathleen was 17. By the standards of the world they both inhabited, it was an entirely appropriate match. By the standard of what Reginald was actually capable of sustaining over years and decades, it was an act of optimism that the evidence of his life at Yale did not particularly support. For the first several years, the marriage held at least the outward form expected of a couple carrying the Vanderbilt name into the new century. Newport seasons were completed. The social calendar was maintained. Sandy Point was built and operated with the energy of a man pursuing his genuine interest. A daughter, named Kathleen after her mother, was born in 1904, and the family appeared from the appropriate social distance to be conducting itself as a Vanderbilt family should. The surface was convincing because the surface was what both participants knew how to produce. What was happening underneath it was the continuation of everything that had been visible at Yale and at the gambling table on the night he turned 21. The drinking in those years was not the social drinking of a man who enjoyed wine at dinner and occasionally exceeded his limits at a party. It was systematic and daily, the consumption of a man who had organized a substantial part of his physical functioning around alcohol over years until the two could no longer be meaningfully separated. The gambling was continuous. The card games and the race courses and the various other opportunities that a wealthy man with no professional schedule and no accountability to an employer could find to place money at risk. The absences lengthened across the years after Kathleen was born. Reginald in Europe at race courses, Reginald in Newport without his wife. Reginald at horse shows and breeders' meetings and social gatherings where the conversation was about horses and the evenings were about cards. The marriage continued nominally while its substance dissolved. By approximately 1912, the dissolution had become a legal fact as well as a personal one. Contemporary records document what they describe as desertion beginning around that year, Reginald having effectively abandoned the household in the sustained way that constituted the legal grounds for what followed. He was absent not for weeks at a time, but for years at a time. Present enough to maintain the fiction of the marriage's existence, but not present enough to constitute a husband or a father in any meaningful practical sense. Kathleen Nielsen Vanderbilt filed for divorce in Newport, Rhode Island in 1919, citing desertion as the documented grounds for the action. The final decree was issued on April 17, 1920. She was awarded full custody of their daughter. The daughter from that marriage, Kathleen Vanderbilt, married Henry Cook Cushing III in 1923, the year her father remarried, connecting the Vanderbilts to the Cushing family. She was married 3 times in her life and died in 1944 at 40 years old, before her father's second daughter by his second wife had fully emerged from the custody battle that had defined her childhood. The pattern Reginald established in his own life had visible effects in the lives produced by his household, though tracing exactly what was cause and what was consequence in these generations requires more certainty about the interior of those lives than the record provides. His doctors told him when he was 42 years old and the first divorce had been final for approximately 2 years that he would die if he did not stop drinking. He had the information. He had the testimony of physicians who understood what his body was recording across 2 decades of daily alcohol consumption. He understood what he was being told. And then he met Gloria Morgan. Gloria Mercedes Morgan had been born on August 23, 1904, in Lucerne, Switzerland, at the Grand Hotel National, where her father, Harry Hayes Morgan, was stationed in one of the many European postings his career as an American diplomatic official had carried him through. She and her identical twin sister Thelma grew up as the daughters of a diplomat moving across postings in Buenos Aires, Berlin, Amsterdam, Havana, and Brussels, acquiring in the process the particular quality of children who have been internationally circulated from early childhood, a slightly foreign register, a surface sophistication assembled from many different social contexts, an ease in unfamiliar rooms that reads as worldliness even when the person producing it is still very young. By the time the Morgan sisters arrived in New York as young women and established themselves at 40 West Fifth Avenue, they had an atmosphere around them that distinguished them in any social setting. The photographer Cecil Beaton, encountering both sisters in society settings, wrote of them in terms of marble complexions and raven hair and what he described as an Ouida atmosphere of hothouse elegance. He wrote that they should have been painted by Sargent, that their noses were like begonias with full-blown nostrils, that they diffused through any room they entered a quality of lacy femininity and slight lisp and foreign accent that made everyone else in the room feel comparatively ordinary. The social pages knew them as the Magnificent Morgans. They had minor roles as extras in a silent picture in 1922. They were, at 16 and 17, already present in the same social world Reginald had inhabited for 30 years, moving through the parties and the Newport gatherings and the New York dinners where his name was still significant, even as his fortune was quietly evaporating. At a party in January of 1922, Reginald encountered Gloria Morgan. He was 42 years old, carrying the accumulated physical evidence of 2 decades of alcoholism in his body, even as his social manner remained largely intact. She was approximately 18 years old, her exact birth year disputed by sources that differed on whether she was 17 or 18 at the time of their marriage, a dispute that would eventually acquire significant legal dimensions when the courts were required to determine whether she had been a legal minor when she became the guardian of her own infant daughter. The age gap between them was approximately 24 years. He pursued her for more than a year. On March 6, 1923, in a private ceremony at a friend's townhouse in Manhattan, they were married. Her father provided the legal consent required for her age. He was 42, she was approximately 18. The world in which this arrangement made a recognizable kind of sense was the Gilded Age social world, where the Vanderbilt name still carried enough weight and history to make almost any configuration seem plausible to people whose primary orientation was toward wealth and position. Whether Gloria Morgan fully understood what she was entering when she married a man 24 years older than her, whose physicians had told him he was dying, is a question the historical record cannot fully answer. What is clear is that she was very young, that he was visibly unwell, and that the marriage was conducted with a dispatch that suggested urgency on his part. By 1923, Reginald was no longer the man who had raced automobiles through Newport summers and brooded magnificently over horse shows and hosted dinners at Delmonico's with the ease of someone who had never needed to consider where the money was coming from. His health had been deteriorating in visible ways for years, the internal hemorrhages that would eventually kill him already beginning to make themselves known in the physical collapses that contemporary accounts describe. He had been told clearly by his doctors what continuing to drink meant. He had proceeded anyway with what looked from the outside either like courage or like an inability to imagine a different life. Perhaps both. On February 20th, 1924, their daughter, Gloria Laura Vanderbilt, was born in New York City. She was a healthy child delivered into an unhealthy household, the daughter of a dying man and a mother barely out of her own childhood, born into the remnants of one of the greatest fortunes in American history, at the precise moment when those remnants were nearly exhausted. In late August of 1925, Reginald served as chairman of the Newport Horse Show, one of the premier events in the National Equestrian calendar, the kind of event that drew the people who knew the sport most seriously and that represented, in its institutional structure, exactly what Reginald had spent years working to build. He gave himself fully to the work of the show. His daughter Gloria was 1 year old. His wife, Gloria, was 20 years old. He had perhaps a week left to live. He fell ill at Sandy Point Farm in the days that followed. Internal hemorrhages began on the evening of September 3rd. He died on the morning of September 4th, 1925, at Sandy Point Farm in Portsmouth, Rhode Island. Surrounded by the riding ring and the stables and the farm, he had spent 2 decades building into something. He was 45 years old. The reports that circulated immediately after his death described the cause as complications from a throat infection, producing internal hemorrhages. The accounts that followed, informed by a clearer understanding of what 2 decades of chronic alcoholism does to the human body, are more direct. Cirrhosis. The predictable conclusion of a trajectory that had been entirely visible for 20 years. When the estate was assessed in the weeks that followed, the picture that emerged stated the case in the only terms that admit no reinterpretation. The liquid assets accessible outside the trust fund that his father, Cornelius II, had wisely established and legally sealed against his children's habits came to approximately $130,000. The horses, the breeding stock, the equipment accumulated over 20 years at Sandy Point Farm were sold at public auction in 1926 to settle the debts he had accumulated. The Sandy Point Villa, the farmhouse where Reginald had lived and where he died, was demolished in 1927. His will directed a residue to his widow capped at $1,125,000, along with the Manhattan townhouse at 12 East 77th Street and the Sandy Point property itself. Both were sold. His father, Cornelius II, had made one decision of lasting consequence for the generation that would follow. He had established a protected trust fund structured to place a portion of the family wealth entirely beyond the reach of whatever habits the next generation developed. The principal of that fund could not be touched by Reginald, regardless of what he needed or wanted, and he had never touched it. It held approximately $2.5 million designated for his daughter Gloria, with additional provision for his daughter Kathleen from his first marriage. Without that protection exercised by a father who understood the fragility of inherited money with a clarity his youngest son never acquired, the story that followed Reginald's death would have had no financial substance at all. Just a widow in her 20s and a 1-year-old child, and nothing behind either of them. His widow Gloria Morgan was 20 years old. Her daughter was 1. In the legal proceedings that followed Reginald's death, questions arose about whether Gloria Morgan herself was still technically a minor and therefore legally incapable of serving as guardian of her own infant daughter. Her actual birth year was disputed, the same dispute that had surrounded her age at marriage, and the courts had to work through the implications carefully. The family that Reginald had left behind was going to require considerable legal attention. It would get it. He reportedly said at some point before the end that every Vanderbilt son had increased his fortune. He was the one who had not. It is a statement of plain accounting, made apparently without drama or self-pity, as though he were simply observing a fact about the historical record that happened to include himself. He could see the arithmetic of his life clearly. The question of why that clarity did not produce different behavior is one the story can pose but cannot finally answer. Because it is also a question without a final answer. What is knowable is that he saw it, said it, and did not stop. For 9 years after Reginald's death, his widow and his infant daughter lived largely outside the Vanderbilt family's active attention. Then, in the autumn of 1934, the family generated one final public chapter that illuminated, more completely than anything else that had happened, exactly what Reginald had built and what he had left behind him in ruins. What Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt had done with those 9 years was conduct a life across 2 continents on the interest earned by her daughter's trust fund. Paris, London, Biarritz, Monte Carlo, New York, and back again, crossing the Atlantic sometimes as frequently as once a month. The fund designated for little Gloria generated an annual interest payment of approximately $48,000, and her mother drew on it to finance a social calendar that included European parties, extended residences in fashionable cities, and associations with various companions whose company she found agreeable. Little Gloria, during these years, was primarily in the care of her nurse, Emma Keislich, and her maternal grandmother, Laura Morgan, the child moving between European apartments and occasional American interludes while her mother attended to the business of being young and beautiful and recently widowed and unexpectedly free. The child's own understanding of her situation was expressed with a directness that no adult around her seems to have noticed in the postcards she sent to her grandmother Morgan in New York from the various European postings. From one, she wrote that her mother was so bad to her that she wished she could run away to New York. From another, the message was simpler. We are moving again. Oh, what a life. These were the written communications of a child who had been given the vocabulary for unhappiness without being provided with anyone nearby who felt sufficient responsibility to address it. In June of 1932, little Gloria developed tonsillitis and was brought back to New York for treatment. Her mother, preparing to return to Europe once the immediate medical situation was resolved, accepted the offer of her sister-in-law Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney to have the 8-year-old recuperate at the Whitney estate in Old Westbury, Long Island, while the mother completed her travel arrangements. Gloria Morgan sailed again for Europe. The Whitney family physician, examining the child through that summer, recommended that the girl continue living at Old Westbury rather than returning to the peripatetic European existence she had been conducting. Her mother, across the Atlantic, agreed. Surrogate Judge Foley, notified by Gertrude Whitney that the child of her deceased brother was now residing in her household, took the straightforward administrative step of reducing Gloria Morgan's annual allowance from the trust fund from $48,000 per year to $9,000 per year, on the reasonable grounds that the child's welfare was now being provided for by someone else. The financial reduction concentrated the absent mother's attention on the situation with a speed that the prior 9 years of absence had not produced. Gloria Morgan filed a petition for formal guardianship of her daughter, seeking court recognition as the child's legal guardian, and presumably hoping to restore the financial arrangement the reduction had disrupted. Her own mother, Laura Morgan, filed a counter-affidavit with the court stating that her daughter had paid absolutely no attention to little Gloria, had devoted herself exclusively to her own pleasures, had taken long trips to Germany and other places, had seldom written to inquire about the child. Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, who had shown minimal active interest in the child until the guardianship question placed the trust fund in play, sued for full custody. The trial opened on October 1, 1934, in the Manhattan Surrogates Court before a gallery that was full from the first morning, and it ran for 6 full weeks. What emerged across those weeks satisfied every appetite the Depression-era tabloid press had cultivated for the private disorder of the very wealthy. A nurse testified about the mother's nocturnal habits, the hours she kept, and the companions who appeared in the household at unpredictable times. A former maid introduced testimony suggesting a lesbian relationship. A German prince implicated in the testimony boarded a ship at Hamburg and crossed the Atlantic to appear in New York and defend his name in person, his ship's progress tracked in the papers as he came. Magazines described as containing images of nude subjects were said to have been left casually around the apartment where the child lived. 6 weeks of testimony about neglect, indifference, moral carelessness, and the particular atmosphere of a household organized around its adult occupant's social life rather than around a child's welfare filled the courtroom and the newspapers daily. The context in which this spectacle unfolded matters. The average American family income in 1934 was $1,745 per year. Unemployment stood at 21%. New York City had recorded 100 people dying of starvation in that year alone. The nation was deep in the third year of the worst economic collapse in its history, with 1 in 5 workers unable to find employment and families surrendering children to institutions because they could not afford to feed them. Against this backdrop, 2 women whose primary disagreement was over who would control a multi-million-dollar trust fund occupied the front pages of the New York tabloids for 2 months. The papers coined a name for the 10-year-old child whose fate was being decided in public: the poor little rich girl. The phrase attached itself to Gloria Vanderbilt and would follow her for the rest of her long life. In the final days of the proceedings, Judge Carew brought the child into his private chambers with only the lawyers and a court stenographer present. He asked her quiet questions for approximately 2 hours. When he asked whether she would like to live with her mother in the country, she said no, clearly and without hesitation. "Never," she told him. "She has never been nice to me." On November 21, 1934, custody was awarded to Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney. Gloria Morgan was granted visits from Saturday morning through Sunday evening each week, 8 hours on Christmas Day and the full month of July. She appealed to the New York State Court of Appeals, which declined to hear the case. She petitioned the United States Supreme Court, which declined as well. Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, who had committed the full resources of her social standing and legal representation to winning a 6-week custody battle, lost active interest in the child with reasonable speed after the verdict was delivered. The household at Old Westbury was orderly and well-staffed and emotionally spare. Little Gloria felt supervised rather than loved, watched rather than wanted, a child whose presence in the household had been the object of a legal campaign without being the object of much genuine warmth. The woman who had founded the Whitney Museum of American Art and who had organized 50 witnesses to establish a mother's unfitness turned out not to be, in the daily practice of the thing, any more suited to mothering a damaged child than the woman she had displaced. Reginald had been dead for 9 years when all of this unfolded in public. He never knew any of it. He had spent 45 years consuming what others had built, had left behind a 1-year-old daughter and a 20-year-old widow and approximately $130,000 in accessible assets. And that daughter was now navigating the consequences of his choices from the witness chair of a Manhattan courtroom at the age of 10, while the newspapers of a depression-ravaged nation watched and provided her with a name she had not asked for. To understand what Reginald lost, it helps considerably to look at what his brother Neely built from considerably less. When Cornelius II's will was read in the autumn of 1899 and the punishments were formally distributed, Neely found himself at 26 years old with $500,000 from a $73 million estate and a family that had made its position toward him unmistakably clear. His mother refused to speak to him. The Fifth Avenue mansion and the breakers and the entire social architecture built across 2 generations of Vanderbilt cultivation in New York and Newport were formally closed to him. The railroad, to which his education and preparation had been directed, had no place for a disinherited eldest son. Alfred's quiet gift of $6 million brought the practical total to approximately $6.5 million, which sounds substantial until you place it against the $36.5 million Alfred kept for himself and the $7 million each of the other siblings received. Neely had, in financial terms, been reduced to the level of a younger sibling, while being denied even the social standing that came with the family's approval. He went back to Yale. He had already completed a Bachelor of Arts in 1895 and a Bachelor of Philosophy in 1898. He returned and earned a Master of Engineering in Mechanical Engineering in 1899, adding a 3rd Yale degree during the years of his formal exile from the family that had educated him there. The decision to return to academic work in the midst of punishment and social exclusion was not a neutral one. It was an act of deliberate self-construction, a statement that his identity did not depend on his father's recognition of it, conducted in the same institution where his father had sent him to be formed, and then tried to use against him. From Yale, he moved into independent work as an engineer and inventor, developing technologies for transportation rather than simply inheriting the organization that transported things. He held more than 30 patents across his lifetime. His corrugated firebox for steam locomotives improved the efficiency of exactly the railroad his family had built, the New York Central that his father had chaired and that his disinheritance had removed him from. He developed a cylindrical tank car for the bulk transport of liquids that addressed a specific practical problem in the movement of industrial goods. He designed improvements to locomotive tenders and related transportation equipment, each patent representing a specific problem identified and a specific solution worked out. He brought to the engineering of the infrastructure his family had built the same kind of patient, disciplined intelligence that the Commodore had brought to building it in the first place, and he did it after being stripped of the position and the fortune and the social standing that would have made such effort unnecessary. Grace, meanwhile, executed a social transformation that remains one of the more remarkable achievements of the Gilded Age, all the more so for having been accomplished from a starting position of formal Vanderbilt rejection. Nicknamed the Kingfisher for her systematic and relentless cultivation of European royalty as social capital, she became within a decade of the punished wedding the preeminent social hostess in the United States, eclipsing rivals who had far more family backing and institutional support. In 1902, she hosted Prince Henry of Prussia at the only private social function he attended during his entire American visit, a coup whose significance in the social architecture of that era is difficult to overstate. She went on to entertain the King and Queen of the Belgians, the Crown Prince of Sweden, the Crown Prince of Norway, and every British monarch from Edward VII through George VI. She routed her most formidable rival, the sharp-tongued Mrs. Stuyvesant Fish, who had been the dominant claimant to social leadership in New York for years, and took the position that the Vanderbilt family had refused to acknowledge she was capable of occupying. Neely served in the First World War as a military officer and rose to the rank of brigadier general, adding to the engineering work and the social triumphs of his wife, a military record that his disinheriting father would not have been able to dismiss. He and Grace remained together for nearly 50 years. The marriage his father had revised his will to punish outlasting the father by 4 decades and 3 years. Neely died on March 1, 1942, on his yacht in Miami Beach, Florida. Grace survived him by 11 more years. The man who had been formally expelled from his family built from the material remaining after the punishment a distinguished and productive life, an engineering career of genuine substance, a social position that exceeded anything the family had granted him, a military record, and a 50-year marriage. The man who had inherited without restriction found in the freedom he was given no equivalent pressure toward discipline or construction. The distinction between them was not a matter of native intelligence or fundamental character. It was a matter of necessity. Neely was required to build because the alternative was genuinely nothing. Reginald was never required to build because the alternative was still tens of millions of dollars, at least until it ran out. What a person does when survival requires construction is different in kind from what a person does when survival has been permanently arranged in advance. To understand what Reginald lost, it also helps to understand the full scale of what had been assembled before him. The Commodore, Cornelius Vanderbilt I, died in January of 1877 at 82 years old, leaving approximately $100 million, a sum that at the time exceeded the total holdings of the United States Treasury. He had built it starting from the $100 his mother loaned him at 16 to purchase a small sailing vessel for ferrying passengers and cargo between Staten Island and Manhattan. He left school at 11. He learned seamanship by doing it. He expanded from ferries to ocean steamship routes to railroads, acquiring and consolidating at every stage, cornering the market on rail travel in and out of New York City at the moment when the railroads were the circulatory system of the entire American economy, and died as the wealthiest private individual in the United States. He was famously direct, famously profane, and entirely without sentiment about commercial competition. His son, William Henry, received the estate and doubled it. By the time William Henry died in 1885, the family fortune had reached approximately $200 million, a figure that exceeded by most calculations any private accumulation that had previously existed in the United States. William Henry had expanded the railroad system westward to Chicago and beyond, consolidating the network his father had established into something even more dominant, and the money had followed the expansion. Then the third generation received it. Cornelius II inherited approximately $70 million, built the breakers and the Fifth Avenue mansion, donated extensively to churches and universities and hospitals, and died in 1899 with approximately $73 million, having neither increased nor substantially diminished what his father had left him. He was, in the financial arc of the dynasty, essentially neutral, which in a family where both his father and grandfather had doubled what they received, and where his own son Reginald would eventually return $130,000 from an inheritance of tens of millions, qualified in retrospect as a form of stewardship. Alfred, who received the largest single share of Cornelius II's estate in 1899, had reduced his $36.5 million to approximately $26 million by the time a German torpedo struck the Lusitania in May of 1915 and took him down with it at 38 years old. He had been distributing life jackets to passengers when the ship went under. His share of the dynasty's wealth had diminished by a third in 16 years of his stewardship, without the systematic application of gambling and alcohol that would eventually account for Reginald's more complete dissolution. One fourth-generation heir provides the exception that makes the pattern fully legible. Frederick William Vanderbilt, the Commodore's grandson through a different branch, received approximately $10 million in inheritance and treated it as the Commodore had treated his first $100, as capital to be deployed rather than income to be consumed. He invested in coal, tobacco, oil, and steel across the industries that were reshaping the American economy in the early 20th century. And by the time he died in 1938, his personal fortune had grown to $78 million. He left it to schools and charitable institutions. The difference between Frederick and Reginald was not the amount received. It was the relationship each man had to what he was given. Reginald received somewhere between $15 and $25 million across his lifetime, from his father's estate and from the bequest Alfred left when he died on the Lusitania, and he returned $130,000 in accessible liquid assets to the estate process. The New York Central Railroad, source of the original wealth, declined through the middle decades of the 20th century as the country's transportation infrastructure shifted toward trucks and highways and eventually aircraft, and was absorbed by Amtrak in 1971. The Fifth Avenue mansions were demolished one by one, the last gone by the mid-1940s. The Breakers was transferred to the Preservation Society of Newport County in 1972 and is now visited by hundreds of thousands of tourists annually as a museum of the Gilded Age. Arthur Vanderbilt II, a family descendant who became the dynasty's most thorough historian, noted in his book Fortune's Children, published in 1989, that none of the 120 Vanderbilt family members who attended the first family reunion at Vanderbilt University in 1973 were millionaires. The Commodore had built the fortune in a single lifetime. His descendants had consumed it entirely within a century of his death. What remained at the end of the accounting was a museum in Newport, a riding ring in Portsmouth, and a granddaughter who would prove to be the most interesting member of the dynasty since the man who started it. Little Gloria grew up in the old Westbury household of an aunt who had fought fiercely to win custody, and then, having won it, directed her attention elsewhere. The environment Gertrude Whitney provided was stable, orderly, well-staffed, and emotionally thin. Rules were clear, and warmth was not the dominant note. The child who had testified in a judge's chambers that her mother had never been nice to her found in her aunt's household a different kind of inadequacy. The inadequacy of institutional competence without genuine connection. She felt supervised more than loved, present in the household without being truly at home in it. At 17, Gloria dropped out of school and made her way to Beverly Hills, where her mother had resettled, seeking the person she had been separated from since the age of 8. The person she had testified against under coaching she later described as having been provided by her aunt's lawyer. What she found in Beverly Hills was not a rescue or a homecoming. Her mother was also adrift, the woman who had been young and beautiful and socially magnetic in 1923, now older and less certain of her position, and the relationship between mother and daughter carried the full weight of the years and the trial and the postcards and the chamber's testimony and everything that had happened between the age of 1 and 17. It was not a simple reunion. It was two people, both of whom had been shaped by Reginald's choices and their consequences, attempting to find their way toward each other across a decade of enforced separation. At 19, Gloria Vanderbilt married Pasquale Di Chico, a Hollywood talent representative who was considerably older than her and who had an unreliable relationship with money. She had replicated at 19 with almost exact fidelity the pattern her mother had enacted at approximately the same age. An older man, a disproportion in age and experience, a gambler's relationship to financial stability, a marriage conducted before the person entering it had accumulated enough life to understand what she was choosing. Whether this was coincidence or compulsion or simply the inheritance of a template that had been the defining relationship of her childhood is a question her later writing circled without fully resolving. At 21, she came into the trust fund that was the only portion of Reginald's estate that his father's legal foresight had kept beyond his reach. It was worth approximately $5 million. She divorced Di Chico the same year, and the inheritance and the divorce arrived together as though both had been waiting for the same date. Her second marriage was to Leopold Stokowski, the conductor who was 42 years her senior, exactly as much older than her as Reginald had been older than her mother. They had 2 sons and a nervous breakdown, and 10 years before separating. In a custody arrangement that arrived with its own irony, Stokowski was granted weekend visits and a month in the summer with the boys, precisely the visitation structure the court had awarded Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt after the 1934 trial. The architecture of custody and loss seemed to recur in this family with the persistence of a structural feature. Her third marriage was to the film director Sidney Lumet, which lasted until 1963. Her fourth was to the writer Wyatt Cooper, who gave her 2 more sons and died in 1978 while undergoing heart surgery. One of those sons, Carter Vanderbilt Cooper, died on July 22, 1988, at 23 years old, falling from the 14th floor terrace of the family's Manhattan apartment while his mother was present. It was the kind of loss that does not resolve and does not diminish, the loss of a child in the presence of a parent who could not prevent it, and it marked the remainder of her life with a weight that nothing before it had produced. The other son was Anderson Hayes Cooper, who became a journalist and eventually one of the most recognized figures in American broadcast news. He said publicly on Howard Stern's radio program that his mother had made clear to him there was no trust fund, that the Vanderbilt inheritance had been spent, and that he had resolved from that understanding to survive entirely on his own work. He built a career estimated at earnings of approximately $16 million annually through journalism, writing, and the kind of public presence that cannot be purchased or inherited or produced without genuine talent applied across decades of serious work. He had done, in the 21st century and in a different industry, what the Commodore had done in the 19th. Started with what he had, which was intelligence and will, and built something from it. What Gloria Vanderbilt assembled from the material her childhood had given her was substantial and genuinely self-made. Her designer jeans brand, launched in the 1970s, earned royalties at 3.5% of $125 million in annual sales in 1979 alone, a number that gives some sense of the commercial scale she achieved. She wrote poetry and memoirs and maintained for decades a creative practice that was entirely her own production, without the inheritance of an institution to stand behind it. She described her childhood as having sent her on a lifelong restless search for love, which is accurate as far as it goes, but leaves out what she actually produced across the decades of that search. Not just the marriages and the pain, but the fashion empire, the writing, the art, the public presence, the son who made his own name, and the demonstration, across a life of 95 years, that the Vanderbilt line had not fully exhausted the capacity for construction. Gloria Vanderbilt died on June 17, 2019. She was 95 years old and had outlived her father by 74 years, and most of what her father left by considerably more than that. She turned the name into something productive. She was the first person in her direct line of descent since the Commodore himself to do that. The full accounting of Reginald Claypoole Vanderbilt's life runs to these facts. He inherited between $15 and $25 million across his lifetime. He left approximately $130,000 accessible in liquid assets outside the trusts his father had protected. He held no professional position of any conventional kind across 4.5 decades of adult life. He died on September 4, 1925, at 45 years old, of cirrhosis resulting from alcoholism at Sandy Point Farm in Portsmouth, Rhode Island. He was entombed in the Vanderbilt family cemetery and mausoleum in Staten Island, New York. His daughter built a fashion empire and a creative life from the remnants of what he left. His grandson constructed an independent career of genuine distinction from nothing. His riding ring stood in active use for nearly a century after him, and the organization he founded in 1917 still governs American Olympic equestrian competition today. But the numbers do not carry what the story actually means. What Reginald Vanderbilt's life illustrates, with a clarity that very few lives achieve, is what happens when inherited wealth loses the living memory of the effort that produced it. The Commodore knew precisely what a dollar cost because he had earned the first ones himself, ferrying cargo across a harbor in a boat his mother had helped him buy. William Henry knew what the railroad required because he had expanded it through his own decisions and his own labor, adding lines and routes and cities to the network his father had built. Cornelius II knew what stewardship demanded because the Commodore had made him understand that the money was not a possession, but a responsibility. By the time the fourth generation received it, that understanding was 3 generations removed. The money was simply there. The houses were simply there. The name was simply there. What had been built through 3 generations of relentless directed effort had become, for the youngest son of the 3rd generation, simply the medium he lived in, as unremarkable as Heir. Reginald said he was the only Vanderbilt son who had not increased his fortune. He was right, and the precision of the observation, delivered apparently without drama, is the most revealing thing in his story. He could see the fact of his life clearly. He could state it accurately. He simply had no mechanism, internal or external, for doing anything differently. He had been given everything at the precise age when the absence of any requirement to build something leaves a person without the capacity to build anything. The heir is shaped by the expectation that he will carry something forward. The spare is prepared by the knowledge that he may be needed. The youngest son, in a dynasty at its absolute peak, receives the name and the resources, and no particular assignment. What fills that vacancy shapes the man. Reginald filled it with horses and gambling and the particular pleasure of spending freely what others had earned with great difficulty across 3 generations. What survived him was the organization he created in a Manhattan meeting room in January of 1917, the riding ring at Sandy Point that stood for nearly 100 years after he died beside it, and the daughter born in 1924, who rebuilt something significant from the ruins of everything he had consumed. The organization governs Olympic equestrian competition today, and very few people who encounter it know who founded it. The riding ring served its purpose for nearly a century. The daughter made her own name entirely. The man who lost everything first still has something standing. It just is not what he spent his life on. If this story gave you something worth your time, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to our channel so you never miss another story like this one. There are more of them waiting.